So, welcome to this video. I wanted to talk a little bit about special senses as a way to kind of round up what we have discussed regarding the nervous system. And here's the plan for this very brief review of some of the special senses. We'll talk about vision, hearing, and balance. They kind of go together, the hearing and balance. And then we'll also talk about smell and taste. One special sense that we won't spend time on this recording talking about is going to be our touch. And this is because I really think that we can cover that in other parts of our course material. So why don't we just make a start at this time? So we really rely heavily on our senses, and one of the things that we saw earlier on is that different animals rely on different senses. If we think of human, for example, a lot of the sensory input that we rely on to operate in the world around us is visual. If we think of, for example, then snakes, they have a very different kind of vision that they rely compared to us humans. They rely more on that thermal vision, seeing the temperature differences as they operate the world around them. And then we saw when we dissected the sheep brain as an example of comparing to human brain, we saw that sheep's had a particularly well-developed structures when it came to the sense of smell. So sheep rely greatly on that sense. One of the examples that I shared with you was that, for example, sheep mother can tell its own baby from the herd simply based on the smell. So again, these senses are different for different animals on what we rely on, but I think it's going to be useful for us to discuss a little bit about some of the general themes as it comes to, and we're also going to look at particularly different senses. Unfortunately, we won't have time to go into a full detail of each sense, so I'll highlight some of the most important points. So let's have a look of these special senses as a whole. So receptors, and we'll find those receptors in the organs where we have the structures that we associate with these senses. These receptors are large and complex structures compared to other structures when it comes to nervous system that we've talked about. And we end up finding these receptors in those localized as clusters. So let's start with vision as our first sense that we'll explore a little bit more. And if we think of the comparative anatomy, again, we end up realizing that humans rely greatly on vision. In fact, about 70% of all of our sensory receptors as humans are in the eyes. And each eye has over 1 million nerve fibers carrying information to the brain. We won't cover all parts of the visual system, but I do want to highlight some of the most important parts. So let's have a look of that. Eye is one of the easiest ways for poisons and pathogens to get into the body if we don't have additional protections in place. So we need to have an alternative way to protect this route of entry. And how this happens is through tears. So tears help to clean the surface of the eye, protect it against many different kinds of pathogens, also moisten the surface so that our eyes don't dry out. Dry eyes are, for example, a clinical issue that we could talk about. And they also lubricate eyes so that they can function optimally. So these tears contain materials to protect, clean, and so on, including antibodies, which are our immune system component, and lysozymes, which are enzymes that destroy bacteria. Let's have a look of another aspect of the eye that I find interesting and worthwhile to discuss. So there's going to be 6 extrinsic eye muscles that attach to the outer surface of the eye, and they produce the gross eye movements. And if you think back on our lab where we had a look of cranial nerves, we saw that 4 out of 12 cranial nerves were dedicated for vision, and out of those 4, 3 were dedicated for the eye movements. So this is something that we discussed during that activity, the testing in suspected DUI investigations, for example. We test these 3 nerves to see whether there's impairment of the brain activity that would then manifest as issues with the eye muscles moving the eye. I also wanted to highlight some structures of the eyeball, and you'll see a little bit beyond the eyeball here as well. Out of these, especially what I'm interested in and where our journey is going to go next is the retina, which is really where the image lands to. I'll let you study these different parts independently, and we're going to shift our focus now on the physiology of the vision. So let's unbundle that a little bit. In order to form a sharp, so in other words, focused picture on the photoreceptors that are on the retina, light must be bent. And there's multiple structures that contribute to this. And what I think is noteworthy here on this slide that we notice is that eyes are optimally adapted for seeing things in some distance away from us. With that, I mean structures, things that we're looking at that are over 20 feet away from us. So as a consequence of that, what we're going to see is that when we're looking at closer objects, so objects that are less than 20 feet away from us, the lens of an eye must change its shape. And this is known as accommodation. Another thing that I think is worthwhile to consider here is the image that lands on the retina. It is reversed from left to right, and it's also going to be located upside down on our retina, and it is, of course, smaller than the object that we're looking at. So quite a bit going on there. So even this image that we're ending up seeing on our retina is reversed upside down and smaller. Our brain can then compensate for this and form the realistic image of what's really around us. But that's how the light lands on the retina. And let's explore what happens after that. So the retina converts light into nerve impulses, and we could see how they pass through the series of structures, eventually resulting in the interpretation of what we see. So few structures for us to consider. First, optic nerve passes onwards from the eye. And notice that optic nerve is essentially, you could consider it as an outgrowth of the brain when it comes to the cranial nerves. Then messages from there cross over at the optic chiasm, which is really this crossing of the messages from these optic nerves. Then messages pass further along the optic tract. And finally, we're passing through the thalamus. Remember, that was for processing and choosing what gets passed onwards and kind of coordinating our experiences until finally we end up to the occipital lobe of the brain, where we give meaning to what we see. Before that, it's just nerve impulses that we're passing onwards on these tracts. A few concluding notes when it comes to the physiology of vision that I wanted to mention. Do notice that each eye sees slightly a different view, and there's quite a lot of overlap between what we see with both eyes, and this is what allows us to have the depth vision. So the brain interprets and combines these slightly different views, allowing us to form this three-dimensional interpretation of the world that we live and navigate in. Now, let's shift gears from vision and have a look at another pair of senses. So let's look at our ear. And there's 2 senses that are housed here. So we're going to be talking about hearing first, and then we're also going to talk about equilibrium, so our balance. And what we see is that we have different organs for these 2 senses. The receptor type that we're going to be looking at here is going to be the mechanoreceptors. So these respond to mechanical stimulus, for example, converting sound waves and vibration into nerve impulses. Let's have a look of the structure of the ear. Ear is divided into three areas. We have our outer external ear, then we have our middle ear, and we also have our inner or internal ear. You'll be able to read on each of these. We'll just discuss most important parts of the middle ear. And I want us to focus on three bones that we find in the inner ear, and these are incredibly small bones that we'll see. And these are going to be our hammer, anvil, and stirrup. And what they do, they really transfer that sound, that movement of the air, condensed and kind of not as condensed air that lands on our tympanic membrane, and convert that into movement that we can then pass onwards. And their role, like I said, is to convert the sound waves, which are essentially more or less condensed air or air waves, and make them into a movement to the fluids of the inner ear. And there we can convert those movements then into nerve impulses that pass to the brain. Here we see the pathway of vibrations from sound waves in the air into nerve impulses, and eventually creating a perception in the brain as those nerve impulses are processed. So let's have a look what's happening here. So we saw that those air waves, or waves in the air, density of the air, they caused us to move ossicles from the eardrum through the oval window. And then sound is amplified by the ossicles, and these pressure waves cause vibrations in the basilar membrane of the spiral organ of Corti. Now, hair cells of the tectorial membrane are bent when the basilar membrane vibrates against it. And as a result, an action potential starts in the cochlear nerve, that was our cranial nerve 8. And the impulses then travel to the temporal lobe. And that's where we give the meaning to what we're processing. But we also want to talk about the sense of balance, as it is very important. So vestibular apparatus is a sensory system that's located in the inner ear that helps you to maintain your balance and a sense of spatial orientation. Vestibular apparatus includes 5 vestibular organs, including the 3 semicircular canals. What we see here is that these vestibular apparatus, they detect your head's position and also the movement, which helps you to coordinate your eye movements, posture, and equilibrium at large. And these also send nerve signals to the brain, which then helps you to make compensatory movements in response to the forces. So these here respond to changes. Let's have a look at that a little bit more. So here we see an example of static equilibrium receptors as we change the angle of the head that causes us then to have a sensation of where our head is positioned. Now, I think that that's a good amount of detail when it comes to the ear and balance organs. Let's shift gears and talk about chemical senses. So we're going to talk about taste and smell, and these two go together because both are stimulated by chemicals in solution. Both of these senses also complement each other and respond to many of the same stimuli. So we will look at the smell first, and we can differentiate a wider range of chemicals there. And then we'll talk about taste, which has 5 types of receptors. So let's start with the smell first. So olfaction is really what we're talking about when we're talking about the smell. And we have olfactory nerve, which was our cranial nerve number 1, on top of the nasal cavity. And we had these smaller parts that pass through the cribriform blade. Remember, those were the holes in the bone on top of the nasal cavity. And from it, we have olfactory receptor cells, which end in olfactory hairs. Now, in order to sense smell, there is mucus layer where the chemicals that we smell must dissolve into. And if we follow our olfactory nerve, so our cranial nerve number 1, back to the brain, and notice it is essentially an outgrowth of the brain, this leads to the olfactory cortex, where we then can process these smells. Now let's look at also taste a little bit more. So taste buds house the receptor organs for us here for the taste. And they are located mainly on the tongue, but also on the soft palate, superior part of the pharynx, and cheeks. Taste buds are frequently replaced also by basal cells. And then if we think about these impulses from these taste buds, they are carried through the gustatory complex by several cranial nerves, because taste buds are found in different areas. So we have our facial nerve, which was our cranial nerve 7, glossopharyngeal nerve, which was cranial nerve 9, and vagus nerve, which was the cranial nerve 10. And really, if we come back to this slide that we saw earlier on, I also wanted to mention in relation to the taste, the 5 basic taste sensations. So we have sweet receptors that respond to sugar, saccharin, and some amino acids. Then we have sour receptors that respond to hydrogen ions or acids. Then we have bitter receptors that respond to alkaloids, salty receptors that respond to metal ions, and finally umami receptors that respond to the amino acid glutamate, or the beefy taste of the meat. And really, I think that this concludes our brief review of the special senses. We had a little bit of a look of the vision, talked about the hearing and balance, had a look of the smell and taste. So I hope that this has been useful as kind of a way to summarize the organs that we so greatly rely on when we look at the nervous system. Like I said, I don't really heavily emphasize this otherwise, but I think it's a nice way to wrap the content together. I appreciate you as always, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.